She didn't speak up, not because she was weak, but because she knew if she lost this job, her son wouldn't have milk tomorrow. What would you do if you saw a woman publicly humiliated just because she's a single mum? Would you stay silent like everyone else? Or would you stand up like the one person who did in this story, in a small coffee shop tucked away in the seaside town of Willow Glen? Something seemingly minor happened, something that would change a woman's life forever and force an entire system to re-examine how it treats its workers. That woman's name was Maggie Taylor. She was 32, a single mother juggling waitressing shifts while raising her 7-year-old son. She had no fancy degrees, no striking appearance, no powerful connections. She had only one thing she didn't give up. And that very morning, she was screamed at by her manager right in front of customers for a minor mistake. No one said a word. No one defended her, except for one person sitting quietly at the corner table watching it all unfold. No one knew who he was, and no one could have guessed he was the one person with the power to change everything, because he was Daniel Clark, CEO of the Baker's Hearth cafe chain, undercover on a secret visit to the Willow Glen branch. And when he stood up and walked toward the counter, it wasn't just one person who lost their job. It was another person who was given a chance to completely change her life. This story isn't about titles. It's about dignity, and how one small action can rescue an entire life from being forgotten. Willow Glen is a quiet coastal town where bicycles still roll along cobbled paths, and people still greet each other every morning, even if they don't know each other's names. On the corner of Main Street sits a little cafe called Baker's Hearth, famous for its handcrafted toasted loaves and the kind of warmth that feels like your grandmother's kitchen. The wooden door gives a soft creak each time it opens, letting the aroma of fresh coffee mix with the scent of bread just out of the oven, the gentle clink of spoons on porcelain, the soft laughter near the window table. Everything here seems to move one beat slower than the world outside. And right in the middle of that seemingly peaceful scene was Maggie Taylor. She wore a dark brown canvas apron, her hair tied back neatly, her steps brisk, but her eyes always carried a quiet exhaustion. Every day, Maggie started her shift at 5:30 a.m., prepping the bread, checking the espresso machine, wiping down tables, and logging the supply inventory before the first customer walked in. She'd been working here for nearly 3 years, ever since her husband suddenly left, abandoning her and their son Eli when the boy was only 4. No child support, no apology. Just one morning, he was gone. Maggie had no one to lean on, no close family nearby, no friends close enough to watch Eli at night. So she worked the afternoon shifts too, squeezing in enough time to rush home before 9 p.m. to help Eli with his homework. Eli was her entire world. Every penny she saved, every skipped lunch was for that little boy a better set of school books, a pair of shoes that didn't have holes in them, or sometimes just a small ice cream cone on his birthday. And yet, despite all her dedication, Maggie was never truly valued at work. To Brad, the morning shift manager, she was just a Category B employee, obedient, quiet, and unlikely to push back. And perhaps the world had gotten used to not seeing her at all. She was the kind of person people passed by like a shadow behind the counter, quick, silent, and forgettable. But what Maggie didn't know was that on that very morning, a pair of eyes truly saw her, saw the calluses on her hands, saw the sweat she wiped from the back of her neck as she hustled between shifts, saw the strained smiles she gave while swallowing her pride under a manager's sharp words, eyes that didn't belong to just another customer, but to someone who would soon turn everything she believed about her worth upside down. That morning shift began with a broken espresso machine and a misplaced pre-order. Maggie was juggling the bakery counter, scribbling down new orders and trying to soothe a frustrated couple who were growing impatient over the delay. She moved between tables like a shuttle, doing her best to keep a smile on her face even as sweat began to trail down her spine. Everything might have stayed manageable if it weren't for Brad. Brad, the morning shift manager, stood behind the counter like a watchman. He didn't help. He didn't lift a finger. He just crossed his arms and watched. Every time Maggie accidentally dropped a spoon, Brad would shake his head and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, making sure everyone could hear. If she hadn't cleared a table fast enough after a customer left, he'd immediately jab a finger toward it. Table 3. "How many times do I have to remind you? Maggie." No one said a word. The other co-workers kept their heads down in silence. No one wanted to be Brad's next target. But things crossed a line the moment Brad made it personal. While Maggie was carefully placing a plate of toast onto a tray, he stepped behind her, his voice calm, but icy. "Maybe if you weren't a single mum, you could actually stay focused on your job." Maggie froze. The tray trembled slightly in her hands. A customer at a nearby table overheard and turned to glance over, then shook his head. Someone else looked down at their phone, pretending not to hear a thing, but Brad didn't stop. He looked her up and down, then delivered a line dripping with contempt, with a uniform that wrinkled. "I'm guessing your house is just as messy as your work." Maggie wanted to speak up, she really did, but her throat tightened. Not because she feared Brad, but because she feared losing the one thing holding her life together, the job that kept a roof over Eli's head. That paid for meals with real nutrition. That made sure her son could smile each night without knowing how hard life really was. So she said nothing. She lowered her head and quietly murmured, "I'm sorry. I'll fix it." But Brad just scoffed, not because he felt victorious, but because he knew Maggie wouldn't fight back. She was easy to pick on, the kind of person people like him could blame whenever something went wrong. But what Brad didn't know was that at table 8, in the back of the cafe, there was a man watching, and he saw everything. The man didn't take notes. He didn't pull out his phone to record. He simply remembered. He remembered every word of humiliation, every furrow in Maggie's brow, every tear that nearly fell but was held back for the sake of responsibility. And soon, he would be the one to change everything. Around 9 a.m., the cafe started to fill up. Office workers stopped in for to-go coffee, and high school students ordered brown-wrapped breakfast sandwiches and lingered to chat. The pressure rose quickly, and with it, so did Brad's irritation. Maggie had just finished a tray of freshly toasted waffles and was carrying it out, when a young boy accidentally bumped into a table leg, startled. Maggie's hand tilted slightly, and a few drops of coffee spilled onto table 4, where an older couple sat, waiting for their order. She immediately grabbed some napkins, wiped the spill, and leaned in to apologize. But before she could say another word, Brad stormed over, his voice booming through the cafe. "You again, Maggie. How many times is it now? Wrong order at table 4, and now you're spilling coffee." The couple at table 4 flinched slightly. The wife looked at Maggie with a mix of sympathy and concern. Maggie stammered, "I'm so sorry. It was just a small mistake. Brad cut her off this time. His voice wasn't just loud. It was flat out cruel. "A small mistake. Do you even realize customers are waiting? Or is your head still stuck in that poor single mom sob story of yours?" The entire cafe fell silent. A few customers stopped eating. Someone held their breath. Maggie froze. Her skin flushed with heat. Her ears rang, but she still didn't lift her head. Brad wasn't done. He folded his arms and stood in the middle of the cafe, raising his voice as if he wanted to humiliate her publicly. "Maybe if you could take care of yourself, you wouldn't be standing here in a wrinkled apron, making mistake after mistake." A faint chuckle came from the corner of the room. No one knew exactly who it came from, but to Maggie, it felt like the final blow, a sharp cut to an already bleeding sense of pride. She bit her lip, her hands trembling slightly as she folded napkins, trying to hide the redness welling up in her eyes. No one stood up. No one stepped in. Even those who clearly saw the injustice simply turned away, because they weren't the ones being yelled at. And maybe they had grown used to watching the powerless get stepped on without knowing how to stop it. Maggie's world had shrunk into nothing but harsh words, pitiful stares, and the terrifying silence of the crowd. Except for one man who had been watching her and hadn't looked away since the very start of the morning shift. He didn't raise his phone to record. He didn't rush to interrupt, because he wasn't there to fix a moment. He was there to fix a system, one that had been rotting from the inside out. And now he was about to stand. At table 8, by the window that faced the street, a middle-aged man had sat in quiet stillness all morning. He wore a warm, earth-toned knit jacket. The collar was slightly off-center. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, but not overly styled, as if he didn't want to draw attention, but also refused to look careless. When the young server brought him his coffee, she assumed he was a retired school teacher, but no one knew the man sitting there was actually Daniel Clark, CEO of the entire Baker's Hearth chain, a cafe network with over 130 locations across the state of California. Daniel rarely visited stores in person. Board meetings, partners, financial reports, his schedule was always stacked sky high. But lately, something had started to feel off about the company culture. A growing disconnect, anonymous complaint letters, and an unusually high turnover rate in a few branches. So Daniel decided to do something few people in his position would ever dare to do. He went undercover, no warning, no cameras, no entourage. Willow Glen was one of the first locations he chose because 2 employees had quit in the same week without giving a reason. And the moment he walked into Baker's Hearth that morning, Daniel immediately understood why. From the way Brad snapped at employees, to the way Maggie's eyes dropped every time she was scolded, everything confirmed the sinking feeling he'd had for weeks. But what truly caught Daniel's attention was Maggie. She had no idea who he was. She didn't try to impress him. She simply worked, diligently, quietly, without complaint, even when insulted. And that was exactly why. She reminded him of himself. Years ago, Daniel had once been a single father. His wife had died young from cancer when their daughter was barely a year old. He had once washed dishes, worked night shifts, and slept less than 4 hours a day just to be a father while attending business school during the day. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, yelled at, treated like a burden to the system just because he had to bring his daughter along to his late shift. So today, when he saw Brad humiliating Maggie, when he saw the loneliness in her eyes, Daniel couldn't stay seated. He couldn't let someone like her walk away thinking she had no worth. Daniel set down his coffee cup, gently wiped the rim with a napkin, and stood up. No rush, no drama, just one simple movement, but one that would change everything in that room forever. He walked toward the counter where Brad stood with his back turned, still muttering complaints at Maggie. She remained hunched over, wiping the table with stiff, robotic motions as if trying to make herself disappear. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice low and steady. Everyone in the cafe turned to look. Brad turned too, mildly irritated. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his tone trying to sound polite, but laced with impatience. Daniel didn't answer right away. He took one more step forward, then spoke slowly. "I'd like to speak to the manager here." Brad lifted his chin, arms crossed with smug confidence. "You're speaking to him. I'm the manager here." Daniel nodded, his eyes locked on Brad. "Good. Then maybe you can explain to me why you think humiliating an employee in front of customers is an appropriate management style." Brad froze for a second, then let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but I don't think we need outside guests telling us how to run our business." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "I'm Daniel Clark." A beat of silence. "CEO of the entire Baker's Hearth Company." The words landed like a thunderclap. The entire cafe went still. A fork clinked onto a plate at table 3. A girl with a laptop looked up, stunned, and Maggie stood frozen in place, dish towel still in her hand, eyes wide in disbelief. Brad's face went pale. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize. I thought you were just a walk-in customer." Daniel took another step forward, his voice no longer soft. "You belittled an employee. You mocked her for her personal circumstances, and you made even the customers uncomfortable. You didn't just hurt Maggie. You damaged the reputation of a brand I've spent 20 years building." Brad stammered. "I was just trying to maintain work standards." "She's always messing up." Daniel cut him off firm and clear. "You're fired. Effective immediately." The air felt like it exploded. Brad froze. His face went pale, then flushed red. You can't do that. There's been no investigation. no formal report. Daniel looked him straight in the eye. I don't need an investigation. I just saw it with my own eyes. And I trust what I saw. Brad looked around the room, as if searching for someone, anyone to take his side. No one spoke. A few customers looked down, trying to hide quiet smiles. One person even started clapping. Brad turned away, shoulders stiff, and walked out the door without another word. Daniel then turned to Maggie, who still hadn't been able to say a single thing. His gaze softened. His voice became warmer, more grounded. Maggie, I'm sorry you had to go through that. No one deserves to be treated that way, especially not someone as dedicated as you. Maggie could only nod, her eyes now welling with tears. And then, to the surprise of everyone in the cafe, Daniel added, "As of today, you are the new manager of this branch." The air inside the cafe seemed to pause for a beat. All eyes were now fixed on Maggie, the woman just publicly appointed by the CEO himself. Moments after the former manager had been fired, Maggie took a small step back, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. She stammered, "Me, but I don't have a management degree. I've never taken any training." Daniel smiled, his eyes full of quiet confidence. "You don't need to learn how to be a leader. You've already shown it through your work, your attitude, and your kindness, even in an environment that hasn't been kind to you." Maggie lifted her hand to cover her mouth. Her eyes shimmered, and this time the tears could no longer be held back. In that moment, she was no longer just another overlooked waitress. She was the center, not because of a mistake, but because of the quiet courage she had carried for 3 long years. The other employees began clapping. One by one, from the teenage intern behind the bakery counter to the young server wiping down tables, they all joined in. An elderly customer near the door stood up, nodded, and said loudly, "She deserves it." Maggie looked around. Everything was happening so fast. A part of her was still afraid, still questioning whether she was truly capable. But when her eyes met Daniel's, she saw something rare, unshakable belief from someone in power, without a trace of judgment. I'll do my very best," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "I know you will," Daniel replied gently, "and I'll make sure you have everything you need, tools, time, and support to succeed." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a business card. "Call me any time, even after hours." It wasn't just a gesture of trust, it was empowerment, a clear signal that Maggie was no longer alone. Then Daniel turned to address the rest of the staff. His voice was steady, but filled with warmth. "Starting today, the culture of this place changes. No more shouting, no more belittling. We will build a workplace rooted in respect, not just for customers, but for each other." The cafe erupted in applause for a second time, this time louder, stronger, and full of certainty. Maggie stood quietly in the middle of the room, her fingers gently clutching the business card. Inside her was a rising tide, not the crashing waves of despair she'd grown used to, but a steady current of hope, slowly beginning to swell. For the first time in a very long time, Maggie didn't feel invisible. For the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The next morning, Maggie arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. This time, she wasn't carrying a wrinkled apron. She held a small notepad filled with ideas she wanted to implement on her first day as branch manager. Nothing grand or sweeping, just small, meaningful changes. Add 1 extra minute of break time between shifts. Create more flexible schedules for employees who are in school. Make sure the napkins in the break room get changed daily. And one final line, circled in red pen. Listen. She made herself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, no cream, just like every morning, and stepped into her shift. But today, everything felt just a little lighter. The staff greeted her with warm eyes, no longer forced smiles. The young intern offered to stay late to learn how to bake. An elderly customer handed her a handwritten postcard that simply said, "Thank you for making this place better." Though she wasn't yet used to her new role, Maggie learned quickly. She listened to every suggestion, asked questions, and made time for every team member. She didn't bark orders. She didn't impose rules. She walked beside them. One day, a young employee came in late because he had to take his little brother to a doctor's appointment. Before, Brad would have torn into him, but Maggie simply said, gently, "Next time, just let me know ahead. Family matters. I get it." And she did, because she'd once had to leave mid-shift herself, just to make it in time to pick up Eli from tutoring. And maybe that's why everything started to change. The cafe began to breathe easier. Customers came back more often. Revenue started rising. But the thing Maggie cared about most was something far smaller. No one walked in with their head down anymore. Instead, employees stepped through the door with smiles, lightly tapping each other's shoulders and asking, "Did you sleep okay last night? I'll bake the banana bread today. If that's cool. I know you trust me." On a quiet Friday afternoon, after the last counter was wiped down and the floor swept clean, Maggie stood alone at the front. She looked around the space once a silent kind of hell. Now, a warm and welcoming home. Her hand reached out, brushing the edge of the new shift schedule, carefully handwritten and pinned to the wall like a promise. We don't have to raise our voices to lead. We just have to be kind enough for others to want to follow. That evening, when she got home, Eli had already fallen asleep on the couch, his little hand still clutching a reading book. Maggie kissed his forehead gently, pulled a blanket over him, and then sat down at the kitchen table. She opened her small notebook once, just a place to track weekly expenses, and wrote a single new line. First day as manager, not perfect, but enough to believe in tomorrow. 3 weeks had passed since everything changed. Willow Glen was no longer just known for its waffles and almond milk lattes. It had become the highest-rated branch in customer satisfaction across the entire Baker's Hearth system. From a store that had nearly been flagged for restructuring, it had unexpectedly become a model of internal culture, as described by the executive board in the latest internal memo. And on one Monday morning, just as sunlight slipped through the cafe's big window, Daniel Clark returned. He wasn't wearing his old brown coat this time. Today, he came in a light grey suit and a deep blue tie with the calm demeanour of someone who'd just wrapped up a long journey. But as he stepped through that familiar wooden door, he wasn't there as a CEO on inspection. He came as something else entirely, a man ready to offer the next opportunity. Maggie was explaining to a new employee how to use the milk frother when she saw him. She froze for a moment, then broke into a bright smile. "You really came back." Daniel nodded, walking straight to the counter and taking a seat on the tall stool, the same one where he had quietly observed everything weeks ago. His eyes scanned the space, every table, every gesture from the staff, as if confirming something for himself. This place had truly changed. "I've heard about the impressive numbers," he began, "but what I came to see was the atmosphere and the people, and I've seen exactly what I hoped to." Maggie bowed her head modestly. "I just did what needed to be done. Everyone here has been amazing." Daniel smiled, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly clipped folder, its cover a soft shade of blue. "Well then, I think you might be ready for the next step." Maggie's eyes widened. "The next step." Daniel placed the folder on the counter. "I'd like to invite you to our headquarters in San Diego to serve as regional supervisor in charge of company culture training for the entire system." Maggie stood frozen. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the offer. The salary was more than double, with full health benefits, flexible hours to care for her son, and long-term opportunities for growth. "But I've never worked in an office before," she whispered. "You'd never been a manager either." "And now you're a great one," Daniel replied. "I'm not looking for someone perfect. I'm looking for someone empathetic, kind and brave enough to lead change." Maggie looked at him, her eyes reflecting a swirl of emotions, gratitude, awe, and the quiet return of a confidence she thought she'd lost long ago. I'll do my best." Daniel smiled softly. "I've never doubted that. Not for a second." And just like that, a new chapter began. Not because someone pulled strings for her, but because someone finally saw the extraordinary in her that even she had once forgotten. Her first week at headquarters, Maggie still felt overwhelmed. The glass-walled offices, the meetings filled with unfamiliar business terms, and the automatic espresso machines so different from the ceramic kettle back in Willow Glen. But the strange thing was, she didn't feel out of place, because every time she looked around, she saw Daniel not exactly supervising her, but quietly guiding her from just a few steps behind. On Wednesday afternoon, after finishing her very first trial training session with the regional management team, Daniel invited her into his private office, but it didn't look like a typical CEO's office. There was no massive executive desk or expensive leather chair, just a simple wooden table, a bookshelf filled with old, yellowed paperbacks, and on the wall, a faded photograph, a young man holding a baby girl laughing in a park. Daniel placed 2 cups of herbal tea on the table and gestured for her to sit. "I want to share something with you, something I don't tell many people." Maggie sat quietly, waiting. Daniel gazed out the window for a moment, then spoke slowly. When I was 29, my wife passed away from bone cancer. My daughter was only 14 months old. I didn't know how to change a diaper, didn't know how to do her hair. I didn't know how to cook anything except instant noodles. He chuckled softly, eyes distant with memory. I used to work 3 jobs, warehouse staff by day, bread delivery at night, and any spare moment. I was studying business management through mail-in courses, reading textbooks aloud to help lull my daughter to sleep. Maggie let out a quiet laugh choked with emotion, but warm all the same. Daniel went on. I was looked down on by managers too. There was one who once said to me, "You think a single dad's gonna make it in the service industry?" And for a while, I believed them. I thought maybe I wasn't good enough. Until one day, a stranger, someone who didn't do anything grand, just looked me in the eye and said, "I believe in you." 4 words, but they changed the entire rest of my life. He lifted his gaze and looked straight at Maggie, and that day, when I saw how you were being treated, I recognized a look in your eyes, the same look I once had in mine. In your eyes, I knew you'd make it. I didn't want to save you. I just wanted to make sure you were seen for who you truly are. Maggie gently placed her hand over her chest, where her heart was pounding hard with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when I couldn't even see myself." Daniel nodded. "Now, help others be seen through the way you lead." In that small office, there were no speeches, no spotlight, just 2 people who had lived through loss, finding connection through the very scars they no longer needed to hide. And sometimes, that is where the most authentic kind of leadership is born. Less than 3 months after arriving at headquarters, Maggie Taylor's name appeared in the company's internal newsletter with the headline, "From waitress to culture shaper across the entire system." She wasn't just fulfilling her role as regional supervisor. She began visiting each store, quietly and without fanfare, just as Daniel once had, asking questions that seemed simple but carried deep weight. Who here is trying their best but going unnoticed? Has anyone ever cried in the break room and felt they couldn't speak up? If you could change one thing, what would it be? Not every place answered right away. Some hesitated, some were guarded, some couldn't believe that someone genuinely wanted to listen. But slowly, bit by bit, the change began to spread. At the Oakland branch, a janitor was nominated as Most Positive Influence of the Month. At the Fresno branch, the shift manager made the decision to split tips evenly between kitchen staff and servers after a team meeting led by Maggie. And then came the quarterly executive summit, a gathering of dozens of senior leaders. It was the first time Maggie stood behind a microphone in that sleek glass conference room, facing people with MBAs, people who had once overseen entire regions. She wore a crisp white shirt, her hair neatly tied back, and held a speech written by hand, not printed. She began with this: "I used to think only loud voices got heard. But now I believe when kind people are truly listened to, they can change an entire system." There was no applause, but the room fell completely silent. And in that silence was a kind of respect that didn't need to be named. At the end of her speech, Maggie shared a small story. "I have a little boy named Eli. One day, he asked me, 'Mom, are you the boss?' I asked him, 'Well, what do you think a boss is?' And Eli said, 'Someone who doesn't make people scared, but makes people trust them.' The whole room laughed, not because it was funny, but because it hit home. That day, Daniel sat in the front row, his hand resting gently on an old, worn notebook. His eyes shone with deep pride, not because an employee had climbed the ranks, but because a person had been healed and was now helping to heal others. In the company-wide email sent that weekend, Daniel wrote, "Maggie doesn't represent fast success. She represents something more important, quiet resilience. And in a noisy world, sometimes the ones who don't speak loudest are the ones most worth hearing." On a Friday afternoon, Maggie returned to Willow Glen not to inspect the branch, but to revisit the place that had once been a wound and had now become a beginning. Baker's Hearth was getting ready for its free weekend coffee program, an idea Maggie herself had once suggested. She walked in without announcing herself, and no one recognized her as regional supervisor. They just saw a woman in a simple sweater, holding the hand of a cheerful little boy, Eli. He was a bit taller now, his hair a little longer, clutching a colored-in map that showed a woman standing in the middle of a room, surrounded by tiny hearts. Eli held it up proudly to a familiar employee. "That's my mum, because she's the one who made this place warmer than the lights." Maggie let out a soft laugh. Then she took a seat at table 8, the same one where Daniel had once witnessed everything unfold. She looked out at the street, still the same cobbled stones, the bicycle leaning against the old tree, and the wind chime by the door softly singing in the breeze, from someone who was once humiliated in front of a crowd, from a single mother who believed she was nothing more than mistakes and exhaustion. She had risen and now stood tall, not because someone pulled her up, but because she never let go. She once thought she was the leftover piece in a system that didn't need her. Now, she was redesigning that very system so that no one else would ever have to feel the way she once did. And Daniel, the man who once stepped out of his chair to change, one day quietly ended up changing someone's entire life. On his desk at headquarters, he still kept a small scrap of paper, a child's messy handwriting scrawled across it. "If you see someone today who looks tired but is still smiling, please don't assume they're okay. They might be holding on just to keep from falling apart. And if you have any kind of power, no matter how small, use it to notice someone the world has forgotten. Because to be seen even once might be enough to save an entire life."